Cool, thanks.
If it's okay, we'll put it on YouTube channel, so perhaps if that's all right with you. And then your podcast episode comes out tomorrow. And if you want the link for that for your own stuff, we can send you that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Awesome, thank you.
It's pretty good. There's a part where we couldn't edit out Marcel laughing really hard. So there is a moment where there's just Marcel like laughing in the background.
It's like,
And it could not be removed.
that's funny.
So.
Reba, there's a live studio audience.
Exactly. It does sound like someone like made her laugh that nobody could.
Like just random.
Yeah. She's gonna come take pictures in a little bit here.
So I've got your angled cups with the bag and some guy wants to buy them. I'm like, no, it's the only bag we have.
Can we?
Well, fill the cups, I don't care.
Just did.
Cups and stuff.
And then
How's it going?
we are going to
Hold of that one, you take picture.
And then-
Still don't know.
send him the link, and then I'm gonna share the Dropbox link for the podcast with him right now.
I don't know where she's at. Be demoing them. I don't.
Well, I saw the bag was sitting on her desk this morning.
She was taking pictures of it. That bag that came from, oh, sorry. Sorry.
I had a
saw it.
little bit of like
I can't get it straight now. I was like, I'm not.
No, I know.
I'm Owen's favorite.
There's priorities.
Hey,
Like
how are
that
you?
stuff for like tomorrow.
It's sort of saying this month.
Oh, see, I'm not your friend on Facebook.
Not really.
You're welcome.
Very interesting, really personal.
Brad, when you make
Yeah, like anything you talked about.
afternoon, do you want to put in?
I have one of the.
But
Do what? The,
You have unicorns?
we don't have them yet.
I have a hippo.
We have the one on the desk, that one. Okay.
Wow.
How excited I am.
Let me, remind me and I can. That's right.
I can take some. Okay.
I have some of them. I think my albums is private up there. So hopefully we'll have it here. I've done that with the boss.
I'm just an open book.
Okay.
Verify that what I should be. Yeah, I kind of like it. We always order the bowl. We run.
So.
Because you're eagle.
You didn't get phones until 2010. What year was that? Oh, okay.
I mean, we did like MS, we had Facebook, you had to take it.
Oh, I remember those days. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
I just found that camera the other day.
No,
I don't think I have it.
Like.
words, but that was on top of it.
Well, we are waiting on more people to arrive. Sorry if
We can
they're
go down
in
it.
the reverse. But we can go ahead and get started to be mindful of everybody's time.
Are you gonna do a little intro or something?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Sourcing and Supply Chain Workshop that we have today. We're really excited to present something on this topic because I don't know if we've ever actually tackled this topic with the Small Business Development Center. And if we have, it was definitely 4 years ago before I started taking the trainings over. So we're really excited that we actually have a resident Rock 31 member who has the skill set and does this on a daily basis with his team to present on this topic and then be able to answer any questions that you have. So a little bit about the Small Business Development Center. So my name is Kayla Vokerall. I'm the Small Business Development Center Training Manager and Business Advisor. I work alongside Lorraine Heinz, who's handing pens and paper out to anybody that needs them. What we do on a daily basis is help small businesses, whether they're getting started, expanding, growing, and eventually plan to sell. We can help everywhere in between. I say we're just a partner in your business journey. We are able to do trainings like this with the resource partners that we have, including Owen and Tara. But we also do business plans, financial projection assistance, one-on-one counseling. So, and then the great thing about it is our services are free. So, we're excited to just launch right in. I'm going to introduce Owen and Tara. They're going to talk to you about global sourcing, and hopefully shed some light for all of us on some more of those details. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, super excited to be here today, and thanks to SBDC and Big Sky Economic Development for arranging this training to talk about global sourcing and supply chain. Talk about also in a little bit more detail about understanding costs of procurement and a little bit of a look at sourcing overseas versus the USA. And we'll also go into a little bit of details on compliance considerations for importing and also selling your product in the US. My name is Owen Hockey and started Empress Brokers, the company about 10 years ago, started in 2010. At that time, I was actually living overseas in China, and I was helping companies find manufacturers. I was going on site, visiting factories. I was making everything from surfboards to pizza boxes and all that kind of stuff when I was over there, which was a lot of fun and got a lot of experience. Ended up living in China for 10 years, and I was working for a consulting company, working with a lot of Fortune 500 companies that were manufacturing and importing and exporting. Some of them were selling in the China market. A number of them were, just exporting stuff to the US. And I had Empress Brokers on the side doing that for a few clients part-time. And then in 2020, started doing Empress Brokers full-time. I'm from Billings. I registered my company in Billings, but lived outside of Billings for most of my career. And in 2020, moved back here and was super excited to jump back into Empress Brokers full-time, helping companies with product sourcing. And we've expanded a little bit, working on import compliance, product compliance, and overall kind of supply chain consulting, which has been super fun, being based here. Work with a lot of companies that are all over the US, and then also working with some companies that are based here in Montana, which has been super fun. And I'm really excited to have my colleague Tara Grace also join today to share a little more on the compliance side. Tara.
Hi, I'm Tara. I've been with Empress for probably 3 or 4 months now. I moved to Billings just a smidge ago from Ohio. So new to the area, new to the career field. But I do all of our compliance research. So all of our clients, I do all of their compliance reviews, making sure their products will match the legal and regulatory needs they need to be sold into the country.
Yeah, and Tara's done a lot of work with, in the short time she's been here, we have clients kind of all over different products, from a surge protector to animatronic unicorn toys and things like that. A variety of different products that we would, stuffed animals, all kinds of different products. They all have different regulatory requirements, which are super exciting to learn about and help our clients through that process. So a little bit about Empress Brokers. We company I started out just going to manufacturers and suppliers for my clients, helping them negotiate supplier agreements, and then sending their product to the US. And that's where I realized kind of the complexity of that whole process, in terms of all the requirements that there are for when you purchase something from overseas and you send it to the US, in terms of regulatory compliance, labeling requirements, and then just understanding the full cost of doing that. And so that's how got started. Now kind of are a little bit more broad, focusing on overall supply chain structure. We do a lot of landed cost analysis, helping companies figure out how much they're actually spending in their supply chain. And I work with my partner, Joshua here. He has his own business entity, focuses more on inventory analytics side, but we have a good partnership and can work together on that to help our clients actually understand full landed cost of their product and actually the total cost of ownership of their products. We do order management. So as a service, helping companies manage their orders, track their commercial documents, their compliance documents, understand their landed cost over time and how that's changing, what their margins are. So that's a really fun service that we offer a little bit more on a strategic level. Also can help with booking freight. I do a lot of freight audits, so looking at how much you're spending currently on your freight arrangement. And then we also do have a really cool partnership with a company called factory quality that does audits and inspections of factories overseas, and they just have partnerships with a lot of assets that can do that really anywhere in the world in a short amount of time. So I've been doing a lot more of that recently. And then through Joshua also can do a lot on inventory analytics, category management, forecasting, all that stuff I don't do. I traditionally just do stuff to the warehouse, and then a partner with Joshua, we can offer a lot more comprehensive service. And then on the compliance side as well, importing your product into the US, you have to be compliant, make sure the product's admissible and you can bring it in, and then also selling the product in the US. Are you going to meet those compliance requirements, particularly if you're relying on your supplier to make your product and do your labeling and things like that. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But our goal today really is to kind of go over, we have like a sourcing and import checklist that we have, go over some of those points as part of this training. Some 101s, give you an idea how to determine some costs. Not going to go into the actual details, but just some insights on that. Talk a little bit about, freight, import duties, your compliance, and how that all factors in buying overseas versus maybe sourcing in the USA, and share some tools and best practices. So hopefully you can leave here and at least have a new tool that you can use that will help you with some of your strategic decision making or day-to-day decision making in that process as well. So, sourcing 101, just what is sourcing, and simply getting your products or materials, from a source to accomplish the task that you need. We do that every day, or I do it every week when I go grocery shopping. I'm sourcing the materials I need to make my lunches and dinners for the week. That's just sourcing. And then the difference is strategic sourcing. So, that's what we like to work on, is the strategic considerations in that sourcing process. So if I'm going to go get my groceries for the week, I'm going to need to, if I'm strategic about it, I'll get some coupons for Albertsons. I used to go to Albertsons, but then I could go to Costco, get in bulk, maybe get a bulk discount on it. Maybe Walmart's having a sale on the specific product I want, or I could go, get USA made stuff, but it's coming at a premium. There's a lot of decisions that I can make there in that process. And all of a sudden it's not just getting my groceries for the week. I have a lot of considerations that I can make into where I source all this stuff. So that's kind of the level of strategic consideration any company or individual that's purchasing product can put into their sourcing as well, and think about all those different factors. It's like, maybe if I'm going to Costco, I have to drive a couple more hours, but I'm getting a discount. Factors like that that you want, and what are your goals for your company, and how can your sourcing strategy align with that? And importing 101, what is importing? Simply any product or service entering the country or crossing a border. So if you're purchasing something from Canada and it's coming into the US, it's an import into the USA. If I'm in Egypt and I'm purchasing something from Morocco, it's an import from Egypt from Morocco into Egypt. So you can import, anywhere. The good thing, and the thing you want to know, in the US, it's a legal undertaking if you're an importer. And making that determination, are you an importer or someone else is the importer, who is actually acting as the importer. All of a sudden, if you're an importer, you are subject to paying import duties, the compliance, the admissibility of the product. You have to understand all of that. The example here is we've worked with a lot of companies where and individuals, maybe they go on to I guess there's a lot of platforms out there that make purchasing from overseas super accessible. Like Alibaba, for example, someone that may go on there and say, hey, wow, I can buy, 10 forklifts for 10% of the cost that they would be in the US. I'm going to order these from overseas. Then they make the purchase, and then, they get held up at the border because the Department of Transportation has certain requirements and regulations about bringing those into the US. They're not compliant. They end up spending a lot of money to purchase this. They don't get the product, they may get fined, and you may not realize that. It's really easy to get caught in the trap where you just make the purchase from an overseas supplier, or maybe it's a new vendor, maybe they're in a new country, maybe you're already established and you're just going to a new supplier, and you can still make those same mistakes, particularly if you're acting as the importer of record. So you just want to make sure you do that due diligence. And I mentioned that there's, that's if you're the importer. There's a lot of different arrangements out there in the supply chain. It can get super complex. This is just, I just wanted to show that there's a lot of arrows in different ways that you can be a purchaser or source, goods in the US or from overseas. You go through a middleman, go through someone like a sourcing agent that would act on your behalf. to find the goods, communicate with the supplier, purchase the goods, and usually they're charging a fee. They're basically reselling it to you. Average is usually about 5% that they'll charge. You know, there's sometimes there's benefits there if they take on the legal responsibilities as the importer of record. Some do that, some don't. A lot of times they have expertise in a certain industry. So if you're in electronics, you know, maybe you want to go to someone that's an electronics sourcing agent and has designers on hand, you know, and they're doing some design work for you. That's one way to do it. And that's typically going to a sourcing company or yes, the sourcing agent, you know, going through a trading company. They may purchase directly through a manufacturer from a manufacturer, different manufacturers, and then sell it to you. A lot of people say, hey, no, I'd rather go to the manufacturer, but there are some benefits going to trading companies. You know, they have relationships with manufacturers if they specialize in a very specific area. There can be some benefits to that of working with the trading company, and they may not act as the importer of record for you. You know, you're still the importer. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but those are the things you need to verify. And we work with a lot of companies that are purchasing directly from the manufacturer. So maybe they have their own designs and it's a contract manufacturing arrangement, or they're relying on their manufacturer, you know, purchasing goods that they're already selling globally, and they just need to purchase components or products that have been on the market for, you know, years or decades. We work with a lot of companies like that. And, you know, different arrangements there where the manufacturer is selling directly to the consumer as well, or our clients are, you know, they're working in drop shipping arrangements where the manufacturer is selling directly to the factory to the final end consumer, with the brand kind of in between there facilitating it. So a lot of different arrangements that you can, you know, have in place. Different levels of responsibility and transparency there. You know, if you're purchasing directly from the manufacturer, you're the importer of record, legal undertaking, you have a lot of responsibilities, but you might have maximum transparency. You know, you can get a full list, bill of materials, all that, you know, full transparency on your pricing. That's great. Or, you know, you could be going through an agent and a trading company and a wholesaler, and there's all kinds of costs in between, but you don't see any of the actual, you know, bill of materials or breakdown. You just pay one final price, but everything's taken care of. It just shows up at your door. You know, it just depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what your goals are. And it's kind of the strategic thinking of how you set up your supply chain, where you want to place your risk and liability as well. And another important thing here is compliance, which is an important thing about this whole process. Tara.
So we're gonna go into more detailed breakdown a little bit later in the presentation. But just to give you a one-on-one quick definition of what it is, it's really just meeting rules and regulations. That's all compliance is. We're gonna, like I said, we're gonna break it down later, but there's so many different organizations, legal bodies, regulatory entities that require so many things from your products. And it's making sure that you cover all your bases and meet those rules and standards, so you don't get fined, you don't get your products pulled, you don't lose revenue, you don't cause harm, et cetera, et cetera.
And feel free to jump in if you have any questions during this presentation. Kayla?
Can we get a feel for what industries are in the room right now?
Yeah, just curious, yeah, anyone here that's in manufacturing space? Manufacturing, and then anyone that's you know, contract manufacturing, or, you know, purchasing from, you know, you're not manufacturing your own goods. Any retail? Yeah.
Clothing brand manufacturers in Peru.
Okay, awesome. And then you guys, where are you guys manufacturing?
We manufacture in Laurel.
Okay, yeah, awesome. And then it's how about yourself?
I manufacture here.
Okay, awesome. Great. No, it's good to know that. I appreciate that context. So all this applies then, you know, to everyone in this room and different industries that you're working in. It's I'm sure you may be familiar with all this. So again, you know, jump in with any questions, going over stuff maybe you've heard before, and you have another particular question, just feel free to jump in. So, you know, where are your things made? That's, you know, if you look at, I just every day I kind of usually remind myself, because that's where I guess I work in kind of global sourcing and supply chain, but, you know, everything that I'm wearing every day is from, you know, different parts around the world. And I bought all this. I think everything I'm wearing, I bought in Billings. But, you know, my shoes are from, I think, India, my jacket's from Vietnam. I think my shirt was made in China. think my watch is made in China. And I think my pants are made in Pakistan, but not everyone knows that about what you're wearing, but challenge you to go and look at your own, clothes that you're wearing. You probably purchased them in town. And we live in a global supply chain, whether we like it or not. I just went and stuff ended up, I shopped at JCPenney. That's where I think I got most of my clothes, but stuff's coming from all over the globe. They have a global supply chain. There's things from all over the world here in the US, and you can always just check the label, look at that made in country of origin labeling to know where it is. And just where are these imports coming from in the US? How global is the supply chain? Of course, lots coming from China in terms of volume, consumer goods, electronics, some food items, Canada, Mexico, a lot of food items, of course, oil and gas coming from Canada. Look at Japan, Germany have a lot of high-end equipment, machinery. Same with South Korea. Vietnam's growing, textiles, consumer goods, India as well. We work with a few suppliers that are in India and have helped some companies move some stuff from China to India. And then a bunch of all these other countries you see that are kind of emerging players, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. We worked with companies that have manufacturers and partnerships in those countries, and other countries like Peru, and I've worked with some companies that are sourcing textiles from Senegal and all over the world. We love working with companies that are bringing in product from different countries around the globe. There's more than just China. A lot comes from China, but beyond that, there's a lot of options, emerging options overseas. Egypt was one that we recently worked with a company that was sourcing from there and getting some cool stuff. So we live, even though there's high concentration and product coming from China, there's still a lot of options out there, and we love working with companies that are have supply chains that are in countries that traditionally you're not bringing in product from. But as consultants, we really a lot of times the same processes apply, no matter if you're going from China or Senegal. A lot of the same best practices really apply, no matter what company you are, where you're bringing product in from. Question get a lot about is nearshoring or moving to domestic sourcing, and where it's feasible. We work with a lot of companies that do want to move some of their supply to the US, and we help kind of look at options there, do feasibility studies, looking at the costs, particularly if they're looking for a component or material, or they're looking for some additional stock. Who's holding inventory of products that they need, strategic items that they need in the US. We see a lot of that happening, and some that look at moving manufacturing over to the Americas. It's more of an investment if you're going to bring stuff to the Americas and have things manufactured here. If you're going to move if you want to purchase goods from Mexico, it's a little bit harder to find a contract manufacturer in Mexico than it would be in Asia. If you're looking for someone to make a product at a lower order quantity, you're going to have to actually invest in that machinery and equipment in that facility in most cases, and it's a more significant long-term investment I've seen for companies that want to do that, but definitely possible. And not to say that there aren't contract manufacturers, but there's definitely opportunities to set up your own manufacturing, and see a lot of companies that are going that direction in the Americas. What are made in the USA and what does the USA to do best? This is just some statistics that I pulled, but consumer electronics and design, a lot of course, heavy on design, the kind of high end part of the supply chain that's going on in the US, but the manufacturing is actually happening overseas. But still have a lot of clothing manufacturing in the US, personal care items. Furniture, electronics, food. We do a lot of food space actually in terms of sourcing. So about 50% of the work we do, sourcing work, is actually USA sourcing. So helping companies find suppliers in the US and manufacturers. So and suitable partners, service providers as well in the US that fits somewhere in the supply chain. Assembly, we're doing a couple of projects right now, finding assembly partners in the US in strategic locations that were by one of my clients' warehouses. So we do a lot of that as well, particularly service providers that are part of that supply chain process, but they may not be making the final good. In some cases they are, but we really like doing USA sourcing projects. And I'll share some tools there that we use to find suppliers and partners that may be helpful for you. Let's show this. This is one analysis did over a year ago, but you know, when you're doing that comparison between, does it make sense to source something from overseas or in the USA? These were some numbers that were pulled up for a solar panel, specific solar panel that one of my clients was looking at. And this was a year ago. The shipping costs were still inflated because of COVID. These numbers, you know, they're not necessarily fully accurate now, but we did a full comparison. There's a number more columns to the right that have, you know, freight costs, import duties, you know, your other transportation costs, warehouse costs. To add in what is your final landing cost of this, I guess we don't have warehouse costs in this calculation, but what is the landing cost to get this to, where are we moving this? I think it was Colorado, and including shipping and everything. So when we bought the unit from China, from the factory, it was $120, but we add on the import duties at the time, and then freight costs, you know, it ends up being $198. You got the same one from the USA. I think it was $220 just for the unit, but you know, to get it to their facility, which is really close, it ended up only adding, you know, a couple of dollars onto that unit. So once you do that, you know, you're comparing, so they're comparing 120 versus $220. We're comparing 198 versus $221. And then there's other benefits there that, you know, hard to put into that final landed cost, but looking at your, you know, delivery time, your production time, and then some of the strategic risks as well, you know, with China and sourcing solar panels at the time. You know, there's a lot of legislation out there in terms of knowing your supply chain, getting a clear bill of materials. You have a lot more legal obligations if you're going to be purchasing that directly from overseas and acting as the importer record, and there's a lot more risk of things getting held up. So factoring some of that in there as well can also factor in your you know, environmental impact to in your supply chain. So looking at all those details, it kind of, you know, we don't just look at that price from the factory, you know, with the X works cost, which I'll talk about. We factor in all those other details to get you a landed cost, and then also kind of your strategic cost of doing that. So what are some of the challenges that our clients face? You know, top ones that our companies that we've worked with and that we hear, you know, raise. The main one, Gilad, is just finding the right partner. It's gonna be manufacturer, supplier, or service provider in part of your supply chain. You know, how do you locate them? Communication with them, making sure that they're a good fit for your company, setting up agreements with them. Really, if you're finding a partner in your supply chain, it can be, you know, a make or break for businesses if they're setting up, or if you're finding a new supplier or manufacturer. A lot of companies we work with are very much reliant on the suppliers and manufacturers in their supply chain for their business. So, you know, if you're finding a new one, or if you're renewing a relationship, or if you're going through that process, that communication in with your manufacturer or supplier, if they're a new one or if they're an existing one, you know, super important and can be challenging. The estimating costs, that's, you know, mentioned that, and I'll mention it more here later in detail. Your transportation, import duties, compliance costs that may factor into your product, and big difference there if you're purchasing something from overseas versus the US. And how that's going to impact your overall landed cost and your profit margins, which that's what Joshua calculates after we do all the landed cost calculations. And then, you know, product compliance, is your product in compliance with the requirements to, if you're buying it from overseas, to import it and then also sell it in the USA? Are you, you know, labeling your product correctly? Does it have the correct testing report that it needs for that industry? That can be a challenge for some companies, particularly if you're relying on a supplier or manufacturer to, you know, label your product, or for the materials or where they're purchasing it from. If you're not directly manufacturing that product yourself, and you're giving that control over to someone else, you still may be responsible for, you know, everything that they do. Regulatory changes and also market changes that impact cost. You know, 2018, we had the 301 duties that raised the cost of importing from China for most goods. And then also just market changes for, you know, raw materials. And those changes can be challenges for our companies that we work with as well. And then regulatory changes to know your goods and have transparency in your supply chain. So there's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. If you're purchasing stuff from China, for example, do you have any forced labor in your supply chain? How do you know that? It can get super complicated if you don't have a clear breakdown of your bill of materials and know who the suppliers are of your suppliers. It can create some challenges for you where you have to prove a negative if U.S. Customs asks you questions about your product and do you have forced labor in your supply chain, you're unable to answer that question. The default for them would be, well, yes, you do. So having more transparency in your supply chain, I think it's a good opportunity for companies because it's a good opportunity to break down your costs and then also negotiate. You can get a more clear idea of exactly what you're paying for stuff as part of a compliance review for that. But that's just, kind of one thing that's been discussed a lot recently because of regulatory changes. And there's a lot of examples there. Solar panels are a really good example. If you want to look at that up about them getting held up at the border and the kind of complexity of the supply chain and where the silica is being mined. And you need to know that if you're importing solar panels. So some common mistakes, in this context of global supply chain, importing, global sourcing. You mentioned that, not accurately calculating the costs. So if you don't do that early on, and even if you don't do it within the first couple of years, it could come to, you realize, hey, my costs are a lot higher than they actually are. And I might need to make some adjustments for this business to make sense. Not reviewing your terms or obligations of both parties in the relationship. And that could be with your overseas supplier, your US supplier. A lot of time, some of the companies we work with, they made their agreements with their suppliers, some of them decades ago, and they haven't really changed their terms or reviewed their terms. And they may be overpaying for their, product or their supplier or manufacturer that they're working with. Should be covering additional costs. And it's just, a review that can open up some of that, you can realize some of that, or maybe you're paying too much for freight, set up a relationship, and you're paying additional fees that you don't necessarily need to be paying anymore. Reviewing those kind of agreements, ongoing expenses in your supply chain. Things change in how you can pay those fees. New service providers are out there, and there's always ways you can save some money, and I'll give you a couple examples of that later. And relying on your supplier or manufacturer that you're working with, for any kind of legal obligations, your product labeling, your meeting testing requirements, verifying all that, so you're not putting all that into their they're not, at the end of the day, they're not responsible for it. You are, as if you're an importer, you definitely are. If you're selling in the US, you're responsible for that. They aren't necessarily responsible for it unless you're just selling product that they have ownership of. Again, there's different arrangements you can do that, but you just want to check and be certain about who's responsible for what in that supply chain. A case study I like to share here is a company that was, they were a construction company, and they were looking to find a new wood molding supplier for construction, for interior construction. And they found a supplier overseas in China that had this great wood molding. I forget what kind of wood it was. And they had got samples, looked great. They're ready to make, I think it was a $200,000 order. I'm getting ready to load a couple of containers full of wood molding. And they reached out to me because they wanted help arranging the freight. So they wanted to get a quotation on the freight, and they sent me over their invoice. It was a pro forma invoice. They haven't made the purchase yet. And then, I looked at it and then said, hey, have you calculated your import duties on this yet? Have you done that review? And he said, oh, this is the HTS code that my supplier gave me. They said, the duties are 0. And then I went and looked it up, and I did the classification of their product. And then the general import duties were 0%, but that wood molding happened to be subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which are retaliatory duties that the U.S. places on kind of unfair trade practices. If it's state subsidized, in this case, China, I think it was subsidizing that industry, so the U.S. put on some additional import duties on it. And then there's also an additional duty item that was just for China. There's the 301 duties that I mentioned. I think those were like 25% that they had missed. And then there was the additional anti-dumping countervailing duties. It ended up being that the import duties on this were like 230%. So if you would have purchased it, he would have gotten a bill to pay $400,000 or something like that to the US government if he brought that in. So he was in a good situation, checked at the right time before he made the order. Just didn't proceed with it. And then we were able to find an alternative wood molding provider in Chile that their per unit cost was almost double what they're paying in China. But with the import duties, I think it's duty free coming in. The shipping was a little bit more coming from Chile, but they were able to put it on a boat and get it here. But it was a hell of a lot cheaper than 230% import duties. But work with a lot of companies, and even existing clients that I have that are established businesses that are looking at new product lines, new suppliers, that you need to do that, review every time before you make a purchase. Even though it can seem very attractive, there's things that, can be missed in that process. Never rely on your supplier to tell you that, the import duty is this. Of course, they want to sell it to you, and they want that $200,000 order, and it's not their legal responsibility to know any of that. So how do you calculate costs? You don't need, it's okay if you can't read that or see it, but just wanted to kind of give an example of the process. There's the materials cost, the production labor cost per unit. I like to get a breakdown of the bill of materials that'll be, the copper, the fastening process, labor per hour, however you want to do it, very detailed breakdown, and then identify who the suppliers of all those raw materials are as well, to understand that cost. But this is kind of the aggregate of that. We'll put in the compliance certification, import duties. There's also a number of other line items that come into that for your other duties and fees. And then we do, comparison, air versus ocean, for example. I just pulled this from one we were actually doing for a client. Me and Josh were actually working on it. And here you can look, I forget what their actual quantity was for this order, but air ended up being $40 per unit, and if it was ocean, it was $26. There's a lot of cost savings there on your mode of transportation. And the product itself just $23 if you include the materials costs and production labor costs, but add on freight and import duties, other fees, it's raising it quite significantly, particularly if you're doing air. And then Joshua also helps out then when we're looking at the total cost of ownership for warehousing, for fulfillment, for delivery to your customers, adding that onto the price that you're actually paying to understand what you're actually spending on one product, to actually get some accurate, margins, depending on how you want to set it up. Total cost of ownership is pretty subjective. Every company does it a little bit differently. It's not really a formula. For landed costs, there is, your product costs, there is, kind of, depending on the Inco term that you're using, which I'll talk about in a second. But here's an example for this. This is a real, product that we were working on just a couple of weeks ago. But product costs, $23. Landed costs, that's to their warehouse, and they wanted to do air, $40. Total cost of ownership, that includes fulfillment, because they were including shipping. Their customer, that's just one of their services. They said, hey, we're going to include shipping for all this, estimate around, $54. There's a range there, depending on where their customers are, because the shipping costs would change. But those are the kind of calculations we want to do. The mistake there is that we look at the product cost. A lot of companies I work with, the smaller, getting started, you're looking at that product cost and you really want to get that down. But there's a lot of other areas in between there that you want to look at as well. We have twice of the product cost that we're actually paying for that's going into this. So there's probably some cost savings in that whole process, be it your mode of transportation, be it if you're using a third-party logistics company, maybe there's some savings there that you can get down on this. You don't necessarily just need to focus on that product cost. We get so fixated on that. We look, compare China, Vietnam, wherever we're looking at this product cost, but hey, let's look at the bigger picture here in the product and be strategic about it. But other thing I want to mention that I think is important for any kind of training for global sourcing and just understanding what you should, or a mistake, I guess, a common mistake that you need to understand is just knowing your Inco term. And if you don't know what an Inco term is and you're working in a global supply chain, you should definitely check out this book, which is this is like the actual Inco term resource from the International Chamber of Commerce. But an Inco term is basically a term that defines it's a shipping term that defines your liability in the supply chain. So if it's an agreement between me and Joshua, and I'm buying something from Joshua, who's paying for what, and when does the ownership transfer actually transfer over to me in this agreement, in this transaction. So the first Inco term is X works, and you probably see this if you see any invoices or doing any purchasing, you're going to see EXW. That's if the seller, the factory, took the box that they just made, the stuffed animal that they just made, and they plop it at their factory door. And then you as the buyer, you're responsible to go pick it up, and you're responsible for all the costs, you're responsible for the insurance, you're responsible for the export documentation, you're responsible for the import documentation, everything. The other extreme of that is, as you see, you go down from here, the seller's obligations and responsibilities increase. And then the other extreme of that is delivered duty paid, which you may be familiar with that term. If you're buying something from overseas and they say, hey, I'm going to cover all this, including your import duties, including your shipping, and just bring it right to your door, you don't have to worry about anything. And they're also having someone else act as the importer record if it's from an overseas shipment. And that's a pretty common arrangement. If you buy something, even if you buy something on I think Amazon or Alibaba, if it's under $800 on the invoice and it's not subject to any other specific regulatory requirements or anti-dumping duties or things like that. But you make a purchase and it's under $800. That's the current rule in the U.S. under Section 321. This trade rule. Then you don't have to pay duties or really file a formal entry with customs. The DDP is used a lot in that situation where they say, hey, I'm shipping this to you. There's still some paperwork, but you don't need to pay the duties and fees. But you just need to check that. That's one thing with DDP. I always say, if someone says, hey, I'm going to send this to you, delivered duty paid, always do your due diligence, because sometimes they're not sending it delivered duty paid, or maybe they're just they're using a different Inco term. They're using DPU or DAP. And they're not actually paying the duties and doing the import formalities for you. And then you would still be responsible for them at the end of the day. So that's something you always want to just double check. If anyone says, hey, I'll send this to you, DDP, always check. Always check your Inco terms and then your agreement. But I created a tool called DDP check just to kind of ask the right questions for the supplier. The shipper in the transaction to make sure that they're actually doing that. So that's an important thing. Yeah, Kayla?
Can you have more than one Inco term?
No, for your transaction, it would just be one Inco term for the transaction. That's a good question, but you can have multiple you could change your Inco term every purchase order if you wanted to. You wouldn't want to do that, but you can have multiple Inco terms with multiple suppliers. So that's something where, maybe you want to unify them because you're working with, let's say you're working with 10 different suppliers. And one of them's FOB, one of them's X Works, one of them's FCA, one of them's DDP. Maybe you want to have a strategy here and just use one Inco term. If you have good connections for freight, and you think you can get lower costs yourself, why rely on your supplier to book that freight for you? If you're relying on them, if you're doing like DDP, or if you're doing CIF, for example, that would mean they're including, the insurance and the freight to get it to the port. You're putting a lot of that responsibility on your supplier. And so they're paying for your ocean freight, and maybe they're upcharging you. Maybe there's some, maybe they're not putting in their invoice what they're charging, the clear breakdown of that. So if you want some more transparency, you could change that term, or if you have a good provider, you get lower freight costs. Why not do it yourself? Have a little bit more control. Sometimes a lot of companies I work with, their suppliers have really good relationships with their freight forwarders, and they're able to get really good rates. They do CIF, and I was like, man, there's no way you can't beat this price that they're offering you. Like, stick with it. In other cases, review it and it's like, hey, they're charging way too much. Let's find your own freight option and let's give you a little bit more control over your supply chain. But you could have multiple suppliers and everyone could be a different Inco term. And that's a lot of times when you run into issues, you're like, hey, I need to align this and understand what my costs are. So that's pretty common. I work with a lot of companies too that import millions of dollars of goods and they're like, I don't know, we don't have an Inco term. And it's like, there was no agreement on it. It's not something that you have to have. It's voluntary. It's internationally recognized. it'll be recognized on paperwork. But the ultimate execution of it, and who's paying for what, really depends on the agreement with the supplier. So, at the end of the day, they were aligning with one Inco term, but they hadn't made the agreement on that with their supplier. So it gave them a good opportunity to revisit it with their supplier, go back and say, hey, let's look at our Inco term and maybe negotiate some more costs or have their supplier take on some more of that responsibility. So yeah, check your Inco terms, exactly, kind of what I mentioned, look at your invoices, your purchase agreements, do they align? I had a client, they had a couple of years ago, they had switched to freight forwarder. They moved to Flexport, who was a newer freight forwarder, but had some preferential, pricing and got them on board. And they were looking at different, arrangements and how they wanted to set this up, how they're charging things. It was the same. They're purchased from the same supplier. They just changed their freight forwarder, and somewhere in that communication, and it could have been with my client, it could have been with the freight forwarder, it could have been with the shipper. The freight forwarder that they were now working with, the new one, was charging my client the origin fees, which were the fees from the factory to the port. So I was looking at their invoices and I said, okay, they're getting charged origin fees. Everything else looks pretty good on this invoice. And then said, hey, well, give me a copy of your purchase orders, your supplier agreements, and looked at that and put those together. And it said, FOB terms, which means that their supplier should be paying all the shipping from all the delivery, the export clearance fees, trucking to the port, which ended up being about $500 to $1,000 on every invoice for those fees. So under their agreement with the manufacturer, the supplier was supposed to be paying about $500 to $1,000 on the invoice. But after they switched to the freight forwarder was charging my client that $500 to $1,000 per invoice, and they import 300 containers a year. So every container, they're paying almost an extra $1,000. Their overall costs have, been about to what they were previously paying on the freight invoices. But their accounting team just didn't know that they don't have the Inco terms, book, and didn't review that. And it's the supplier, the supplier they're purchasing from, probably like, hey man, we haven't been getting bills for freight fees, like don't say anything. And then I told him, I was like, hey man, tell your freight forwarder to not charge charge the shipper, the supplier, the origin fees, because that's how we're supposed to do it in this agreement. And then they started doing it the next day, and then saved them $500 to $1,000 every shipment, 300 times a year, saving them hundreds of thousands of dollars just for making that change. And if we wouldn't have caught that, they'd probably still be paying that. I don't know who would have caught that. And that's just kind of a difference. Your overseas suppliers are always usually, not always, but they're going to be more educated on the Inco terms. If you take an accounting class overseas, I actually went to school in China, and everyone knows what an Inco term is. And it's because they're doing, they're just kind of training for the global import-export world. I'd be surprised if most accounting classes, went over that. So if you have someone reviewing your invoices, and pretty much most companies that, are operating in the US, they have some invoices with overseas suppliers. You got to be checking those Inco terms. And sometimes your suppliers, they might take advantage of you, or if you're, if you're paying something that maybe they should be paying, they might not say anything. Most suppliers are, honest, and they'll let you know, but just something that you want to be reviewing, and then be proactive of it. There's strategies that you can make depending on your Inco terms. Sometimes you can get better, cost arrangements, or, if you want to have more visibility in your supply chain and review the costs in more detail, you can change your Inco term and do that. Or if you want to reduce your liability, you're like, hey, I don't want anything to do with any of these legal requirements, have them do DDP and verify that they're actually doing it. So it just depends what your goals are to do that, and to double check. Another important part of this, importing things into the US, is it admissible into the US? Can you actually bring it in? There's certain things that you can imagine, be more challenging, bringing weapons into the US. There's a lot of weapons that are imported in the US. Those are held to a pretty strict requirement in terms of the documentation that you need, approvals that you need to bring it in. You can't just order some guns off Alibaba and be shipped to your house, even if they're under $800 on the invoice. Probably get held up at customs. And even for products that you might not expect it, that may need to be checked. for different regulatory agencies, think of USDA, they oversee a lot of products, anything that's, wood, animal products, things like that. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, which Tara will talk a little bit about, super important for any kind of consumer goods. And they have the ability to detain things at the port and inspect them. And maybe some of the companies in the room, are familiar with that process and the paperwork that you need to handle that. But you have EPA as well, Environmental Protection Agency, FDA, of course, if it's any food product or medical device. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to bringing in stuff into the US that'll be looking at your product. And in every country is different in how they do it, but they all have similar structures. So just an example, this is going back to the wood molding, but the kind of data you'd want to check from customs. So you can log into the system and pull up based off the HTS code, the classification of the good. What it might be subject to. As I mentioned, that specific product, the duty rate is 0. This is the main duty rate. Then there's a duty rate that applies to like Cuba and North Korea. But then there's other flags that come up in this one, that other government agencies. You have a USDA, it's a wood product. You need to have some additional paperwork that you need to provide. I had a client that was importing wood products, wood frames. And they got the order, came in, and then the customs broker they were working with said, hey, you need to fill out this document for APHIS under USDA. And we need to know that, the species of the wood. And they asked their supplier, and the supplier's like, I don't know, we don't know what kind of wood this is. It's like, we're making these wood frames, but they're like, well, you need to know this to actually import it. So having that document, having that information before you actually make the purchase, they ended up figuring it out. And we helped them through that process actually, but you need to do your homework before you actually make the purchase. And here, this would have told us that, the anti-dumping and countervailing duties may apply, you need to check. And then other flag, which is the China one, additional China duties may apply because it's coming from China. And then the other thing that'll list, is if maybe there's some preferential duty rates. If you're looking at free trade agreements with other countries that you're importing from, Peru, for example, you're going to have a free trade agreement. You might get preferential 0%. Duties coming in. Africa, you have the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So if you're importing stuff from certain countries there, South Korea, Colombia, looking at those as well, flag may or may not apply. Hey, let's look into that a little bit more. So you may find some cost savings opportunity. You may find some red flags here. And things you don't want to see, or you may find some, things that you can look into and maybe save some money. So that's part, the import compliance. Can you bring it in or not? What's it going to cost? And then the other important thing for any product that's brought into the US is the product compliance. Yeah, Kayla?
Where do you find that to search those things? Is it better just to have somebody that's knowledgeable in that, or is it like I can go on PGA?
Yeah.
And it'll tell me the things.
The import duties, that's public information. You can go find that. A lot of importers, they're going in classifying their own goods, so you can figure that out. The anti-dumping, duties and stuff, you can find those. They get a little bit more complicated. You have to read rulings and things like that, and it can get to the point where there's judgments or that have been made on the actual classification of it, and you need to review that. It's all public. I mean, go find it. It's just recommend having someone else navigate it. For the government agency flags, that one you go to your customs broker, freight forwarder, or other service providers that can have those, because customs changes those. So we're a customs broker. I use a third-party software that has access to customs data, so I get the most accurate changes, because there's changes almost every month that are going on to this information. But I wish it was more accessible. It's easier for folks to go navigate it, and that's where we try and help people out so they don't make that mistake. Because it's like, how would I know if I'm going to import a bunch of wood that I needed to fill out this documentation? Unfortunately, the US government doesn't make it super easy for you to go do that. Other countries do. Some other countries do make it easier for consumers and buyers to get that information, but it's not. I think we're moving in the direction of making things more accessible. It's easier to do that, but it's all out there. But it's just kind of super complicated to pull it all together. So on to product compliance, Tara.
Okay, so once you do all of that really confusing import duty stuff, then you have to look at your product specifically and figure out what regulatory and legal standards that product specifically has to meet. And that's what product compliance is at the end of the day. It's meeting safety standards, quality expectations, and labeling requirements that are set forth by regulatory bodies and legal entities. It's super crucial to be compliant. I mean, it can lead to your goods being held at customs. It can lead to, you know, health hazards for your consumers. It could lead to injuries. Especially for children's products, it could lead to child injuries. That comes back on you, that comes back on your company, comes back on your reputation. And you can also just be penalized. States can sue you or they can fine you. And they're not gonna fine you for the year they find it. I think we're gonna go into it a little bit later, but say that say you've been selling the hippo for 5 years and this hippo has not been state registered for all 5 years you've sold it, you will be fined for all 5 years you've sold it not compliant. Not just the year you found it. It's not like oh, you didn't do that, start doing it. It's like, could put your company out of business depending how long you've been doing it.
And I just want to say, you know, same with import duties, if you have the wrong classification, that can you can retroactively come back and say, hey, you have been paying duties, or it was incorrectly classified for the past, I forget how many years ago back. But you know, past years can come back and pay. It's not like, oh, they just found us out or something like that, you know, let's change our classification now and get in the right one. It's like, well, you may have to pay the ones that you've been paying over the past years, and if it's 200% that you didn't know about, you know, that could be a huge bill that would, you know, push you out of business. So same with, you know, compliance, you know, you got to make sure if it's not compliant now, doesn't mean that you shouldn't do a review to make sure that, you know, it is compliant.
Right. So I brought a compliance example. I got this little hippo for free from Toyota when I bought my car. So I did not buy it. They imported it from China. They are just giving it out for free. So you have to be compliant whether you're giving them out for free or you're selling them. Whether you're making a profit or not, everything you have has to be compliant. So I'll pass it around, but you can kind of see, so for every stuffed product, so it's stuffed with cotton, every stuffed product from like a stuffed toy that you're buying to a mattress has to have this very fancy thing called a law label. Again, completely legal. It is illegal to sell a stuffed product without it. You will get held at customs without it. On this law label, it requires certain information. So when you see this one, you'll see it says who the importer is. It's hit promotional products. It says, okay, well, where are they at? They're in Florida. Where'd the hippo come from? It came from China. And then it says, okay, what's it made out of? How do I clean it? And then also, is it state registered? So again, stuffed products have to have a state registration. So every state that this hippo will go to, or they're getting these hippos out to, has to be state registered with a special state registration number. You'll also see that at the bottom. It's the number that says regulatory number, starts with a PA. So yeah,
So Toyota seems compliant.
hopefully. Don't hurt my hippo. That's my special hippo. That's in my car. But yeah, so that's just kind of the start of the whole thing. And the funny thing is, if you go home and you have kids or you look at your mattresses, you'll see those tags. We've cut them off. I've cut them off for years.
They do not cut off.
And then you cut them. Yeah, those are all regulatory legal tags. So compliance can get super complicated. So this is one of my favorite examples. It's one client works in the pet industry. It's two products they're selling in the same industry. They're in the pet industry. You wouldn't think compliance would be so totally different. It's going to the same consumer who has a dog. One of them is going to be a compact wireless fence. It's kind of like a wireless fence, but it goes based off the dog's collar. Instead of you having to wire stuff underground, making a wireless fence, it goes off of Bluetooth and radio frequencies that are from the dog's collar to the owner. So they're selling that. They need a compliance review on that. And they're also selling this agility set. Two completely different products in the same vein. But in this one, they had two completely different compliance review protocols. So for this one, we're looking at, okay, what's mandatory if you have a Bluetooth device? What's mandatory if you have a radio frequency? What's mandatory with lithium batteries? The collar had lithium batteries, and that alone, you wouldn't think, but has its own compliance standards that you have to meet, special labeling requirements. If you go, they actually sell us at Shields. If you go and look at Shields, it tells you like, hey, this contains lithium batteries, just a warning, can cause harm. Like, if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know to put on your package, you wouldn't be compliant. So we're looking at all these kind of electrical standards that are met with this. And then you look at this agility set and you're like, okay, what do I have to do here? Well, okay, so this vinyl plastic film on the tube, that's regulated. Is it how much vinyl is in it? How flammable is it? What's the suffocation warning on it? All these little pieces have like rubber and styrofoam and stuff on it. How flammable is that? Is it suffocation? All that stuff. So we're not looking at within batteries, we're not looking at electrical components, we're only looking at the components of the like the chemical makeup of these things. So same client, same review, I did these in the same week, two completely different things. I was looking at two completely different kind of regulatory needs for those. Okay, so that being said, we know that all of our products have these needs. Where do we figure out where these needs to be met? It's even more complicated, which is sad to say. But the first question you want to ask yourself when you're buying a product is, what entity does my product fall under? Because there's two veins of avenues that kind of lead into each other at the end of the day. You have governmental organizations that are setting your legal requirements. So these are the ones that like the states will come after you. You can be held in customs. These are the illegal things that if you aren't meeting these, your product is illegal. And that's going to be like your FDA for your food, your FCC, the Federal something commission.
Communications.
There we go. Federal Communications Commission, and then the Consumer Product Safety Commission. That's all consumer products are going through that. Specifically, all children's products go through that. Good to know, but all of our children's products have very severe compliant requirements they have to meet, and that all goes through a Consumer Product Safety Commission. And if those meet, like those compliance needs aren't met, illegal. Like, cannot sell it. You will be fined. It will be held at customs. You're not bringing it into the country. Yada yada. Okay, so you start there. You go through your governmental organizations. You're like, I'm good. Okay, but what about your industry? Because then you go into regulatory agencies inside your like personal like industry that then has its own industry standards. So one of my favorite examples with this is I was looking at like lighting fixtures. One of our clients was importing lighting fixtures, and so we went through what we need to do with the government. We just had like a bunch of electrical components that we had to make sure that we were meeting, that was all good. Okay, but then Home Depot and Lowe's won't sell your product unless you are either UL certified or ETL certified. These technically aren't mandatory. Our client does not need to be in these two to sell his product. It's not illegal. He can sell it wherever he wants. But in his industry, Home Depot and Lowe's says we're not selling electrical components that aren't then again safety tested in these regulatory agencies. So that's another testing that he had to go into. So a lot of words. With every product you have to go, okay, which entity does my product fall under? Okay, now inside that entity, what requirements do I have to meet? Which can, give you standards upon standards upon standards. Okay, so you find those standards, you take one standard out, okay, what is this gonna require testing? Do I have to send my product off to a different country, a different state to get tested? Do I have to put something on my packaging? Do I have to put something on my physical, like, item? Do I have to register with the state? So like the little hippo guy, that number, that was registered with the state. So not only is it labeled on the product, not only did it get tested to make sure that it actually is made of polyester fiber, but it also had to go through every individual state that it's going to be in to be registered individually. So if you don't look at this from the beginning of getting your product, it could hold you up a couple months, weeks. So yeah, it just gets a little bit more complicated from there. Another case study. So I had a client a little bit ago who was selling compression sheet sets on Amazon Marketplace. They were made for children. So they're special children's compression sheets. They were made for children with autism who just need like that kind of pressure on them while they're sleeping. They were selling it on Amazon. They reached out to Owen and I, and they're like, hey, my product got pulled off Amazon saying I wasn't compliant. Here's my product. And so Owen goes, can you do a deep dive on what's going on? So I take their product, and based on what their product is and based on the legal definitions, their product is technically a home textile made for children. So that's the way I go about it. I go, okay, it's a home textile made for children. So at the end of the day, every single children's product, whether it's for sleeping or playing or I don't know, even infant care, it has to have what's called a children's tracking label. It comes from that Consumer Product Safety Commission. But basically on this label, you'll see it says you'll remember if you from the hippo, it says what's the material made of, what ages is it for, how do I clean it? That's that registration number you guys already saw. Where is it made from? What's the batch number? So if anything were to happen, if you realize that your items are now causing flammable harm, suffocation harm, okay, I need to pull everything that's 2205. Pull them all. And then your consumers can look at their label and be like, okay, my product is definitely getting pulled. And then it says who's selling it, where did it come from, etc. That has to be on every single child's product you see. I remember Owen telling me that, and then I went home to my nephew who I live with, and I'm like looking at all of his toys, and like sure enough, on every single one of his toys, all of his clothes, that's on there. So I go back to the client, I go, hey, you guys are missing this label, it's got to be this. If you're compliant with all the testing you had to get done, then it's got to be this. And they go back, they go, no, we have that. That's on our sheets. And so I go, okay, can you tell me more about why Amazon pulled you? And he's like, yeah, it says it didn't meet the child's sleepwear compliant requirements. totally different vein. Like I'm over here in home textiles, looking at the entire long list of things we need to do for home textiles, and Amazon thinks they're over here in sleepwear. Which again is like, you think it's gonna be the same vein, it's sleeping, it's for children, what could be so different? Vastly different. They end up getting pulled because they didn't have this bright yellow garment tag. And this is only for children's sleepwear. Only children's sleepwear needs this special tag that says, hey, this is not flame resistant. This could catch fire, warning. Only on children's sleepwear. So their compression sheets, because it was miscategorized on Amazon, was actually failing compliance standards because it didn't have this bright yellow tag that says, hey, it can catch fire, which it doesn't need because it's not sleepwear. So I go back to our client, I go, okay, well, you're missing this and you don't need it and you're not sleepwear. So now they're in the works with going back to Amazon saying, hey, it's miscategorized. I'm not sleepwear. According to the legal definitions, I'm a home textile. But that's taking weeks. If Amazon pulls you for a compliance requirement, it can take up to like months to get your product back up there because that's how serious Amazon takes their compliance requirements on their personal side. So now our client has lost, I think it's going on, yeah. Hi.
So question, how often does miscommunication happen with products?
Miscommunication, I mean, it can happen often. I mean, we had another client who had been selling weighted blankets for probably going on a year or two now, and they've never been state registered. And that is a state registered like compliant need. So technically they've been borderline illegal selling these products in America because they haven't had it. Not always do you get caught. I mean, they haven't been caught, but luckily we caught them. But this can happen super often. We've had lots of clients come to us that are like, they're like, hey, my stuff's being held at customs. Why is it being held at customs? Well, if you went all the way down the rabbit hole, you find out, well, you're missing a lot label, or, hey, you didn't put the right registration on this, or, hey, it doesn't tell the accuracy of like what's stuffed in it. And that's just because compliance can get so complicated. There's just so many regulatory agencies to go through. There's so much testing you need to be done. And especially with children's products, which I feel like lately most of my focus has been on, it's like so highly like governed on like what comes in, how it's used, and how you're tracking it, which again, it's really good. Our children are safe. Products coming in for our kids are being thoroughly tested, thoroughly labeled, which is fantastic news. But yeah, if you miss one small thing, it can be illegal, it can be held. It's more common than you think it is, just because of how complicated it can be. Yeah, because not only like if you go back to the governmental agencies, not only are you in the CSPC with your consumer good, but you're also in the FCC because those will overlap. And then there was a regulatory agency called ASTM, then you can also overlap into there. And it's like the flammability requirements to like make sure you match up to all of those. Just gets super complicated. I feel like I'm reiterating it, but yeah, it can get a little much.
It can get super, complicated. And, the importance of this is a lot of our, companies that we work with, you're relying on your supplier, your manufacturer to create these labels and put them on your product. So you have to be aware of, what you need to put on there. Because if you rely on, going back to that, kind of best practices, never rely on your supplier or manufacturer for your compliance. You need to check that before you get your product made, before you import it, and understand what those are. And some of these, like the children's tracking label, that can impact your admissibility, your ability to import in the US, because the Consumer Product Safety Commission has the ability to hold stuff up at customs. But if you have the sleepwear tag isn't on there, they might not hold it up at customs for that, but you might get in trouble of selling it in the US if you're selling children's sleepwear without that label. So it just totally depends on, where you could run into some challenges, but having that awareness of it, and working with legal counsel, there's someone that's working on product liability to put together your language for your product and also do an additional review of this is super important. But we found that, just for anyone that's sourcing new product and having an understanding of that in the process to get the certification, another, example product we're working on is a surge protector. If you're interested in looking at more, you have the UL. This one's UL listed. We're working on a similar product for one of our clients to this, and working through the process of getting it UL listed. But you'll see, the UL listed labeling on there, and we work with other service providers and legal counsel depending on the product that and the requirements for it. We work with UL to help, companies get through that process, get their product UL listed or UL registered as well, depending on what they need to do. A lot of times, manufacturers or suppliers may be willing to bear some of that compliance cost. If it's a product that they're able to sell and it's not owned by our client, it's a contract manufacturing relationship. Sometimes the suppliers can bear that cost. Other times our clients, they'll be paying the fees for certain certifications that they need. Kind of depends on the arrangement that you have set up. So I wanted to share some tools. This is where hopefully you can leave today with some just maybe one or two additional tools that you can use, online tools. The one recommend on the sourcing side, particularly if you're looking for to hire someone to help you find a new manufacturer, explore a new market. Maybe you're currently purchasing your product from Vietnam and you want to explore Indonesia, and you want to just see what's out there. Hire a local. Upwork is an awesome platform for hiring freelancers and some established sourcing companies that are on there, or freelancers where they're not really acting as an agent. But they can go in and pull together some ideas, suppliers for you. I use Upwork and I hire people, and I also offer my services on Upwork. There's other freelancer platforms, Fiverr. I haven't really used it. I know there's a few other ones. Josh wasn't there, and a couple other ones. Freelancer platforms.
No, I had some marketing materials made on Fiverr, but
yeah.
Work on it.
Yeah. But Upwork's really, pretty strong on that. If you're looking to hire someone, recommend you doing that if you haven't, for small projects or long term, particularly if you're looking at new countries and you want to hire a local to check something out. Platform to use. This is kind of for sourcing, USA sourcing. Thomas is really the best. It used to be a printed out book of all manufacturers in the US, over 100 years old, and now they have a digital platform that you can go and access. It's free. I use it whenever we have a USA sourcing project, or also service providers are on there as well. Makers Row is one that you have to pay for, but you can find some craft and niche suppliers and manufacturers. One company I worked with, they were looking for someone to craft a thing out of walnut, very delicate item, and they found someone on Makers Row that could work as a contract manufacturer and produce their product in kind of smaller batches. Pretty cool. Asia, Alibaba, of course, and just keep in mind, Alibaba, that's pretty much all China manufacturers. They do list some that would be like an Indian, most of those are owned by Chinese companies and may have factories overseas. It's not really, if you're looking for, global supply chain, Alibaba is just going to really show you China options or China owned options in Asia, and some others that are outside of Asia as well. But heavy concentration on China. India, for example, like India market outside of China, there's not really I haven't found any good platforms finding suppliers in specific countries. If you're looking like Vietnam or Indonesia, they all have their own. They're kind of messy. None of them are intuitive and easy to use as Alibaba. But India Mart's one for India, but there's some issues there with the suppliers and manufacturers. They're paying additional money for additional rankings and things like that. It's not super transparent, but we've used it to find suppliers in India. So there are resources out there that you can find in Asia outside of Alibaba, just a little bit more challenging to navigate. And then global MFG Compass. There's a few other ones that are paid for as well that are just directories of global manufacturers out there. But the one I really like to use, particularly for US clients, is I like to use Import Yeti to kind of get an understanding of supply chains. And that's where they take the bill of lading, which is a document that they'll use for transportation of goods into the US. And it's public information for any company. So you could go back and look up your own company if you're importing on Import Yeti, and you might be unpleasantly surprised that your suppliers are listed there, and it shows how many containers that you brought in, and all the details that maybe you thought were secret that are actually public. And you can use it also to look up your competitor information too, or just general supply chains. There's ways to obfuscate that if you want to through trading companies or who's exporting and importing, but it's all public. Who's the actual exporter and importer? And what's included in the shipment. And then compliance, Tara, I know you have a couple of recommendations there for compliance
So I threw a lot at you, and that could be super overwhelming. I know when I started and no one started talking to me about this, I was like, can't do this. There's no way. That's so complicated. No, thank you. But that's where these tools are super helpful. So the regulatory robot is a free use. So it's free to use. It's on the CPSC website, but it is CPSC only. So it's only for consumer goods. It's not going to cover, FDA, firearms, medications, or medical equipment. It's just consumer goods, but it's a really great starting point. It's going to tell you, hey, look at these standards, look at this testing, consider this, consider the tracking label. Here's what you need for your tracking label. It's a really great starting point. I usually use it as an ending point for myself, as like kind of like a, did I check my boxes? Did I finish everything? But again, it's free, so it's a great tool to utilize. Compliance Gate is the one I use the most. It is paid. I think it's fairly economical though, but it does a really great job of taking everything, again, besides the FDA, firearms and medications or medical equipment. Besides all of that, it does a really great all-in-one kind of shop. It's gonna go down every single kind of standard to think of. Okay, so it's first it's gonna put you through a checklist. It says, what's my product? Where am I selling it? It does in the USA market, it does the EU market. So you're selling in the United States and it's a home textile. So you check these little boxes of what your product is defined as. And it goes, okay, it's gonna ask you very yes or no questions based on what your product is. Your product made of wood? Is your product going to be in a plastic bag? Does your product meet these requirements? And then list the requirements for you to go check. Yes or no. And then you just answer those simple questions. And that's going to give you a nice, cool report that says, look at these standards, start here, figure out where your product goes in here. Here's where you should get testing. And then it takes that and it says, okay, here's where you can get testing. Here's where you can book it. And then it says, oh, also you need these certifications to be on your product. Here's how to make them. It's got like certification templates. It's got test booking, and then just a really great breakdown. So I really like Compliance Gate. I always highly recommend it. Even for free, it's got a lot of great information. Just like stuff about tracking labels, stuff about, okay, is my product compliant? How do I figure out if it's compliant? What is the UL? What is ETL? What's the difference? It's got articles like that on there too. That's all for free also. So super great tool. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, super useful. We've got online tools that you can use. We use those. Another one is KYG Trade, Know Your Goods Trade. They're newer, but they can do kind of a more detailed breakdown. Basically you input your bill of materials and it kind of helps with the tracking compliance requirements for your product. They're newer and they also do export compliance, but pretty cool platform. They can also do classifications on there and help kind of manage your documentation, but definitely worth talking to them if you also export product and if you import. And then freight costs, calculating freight costs is super important for what we do when we're doing feasibility studies between countries. If you're looking at Vietnam versus Africa versus Senegal, you're going to want to understand what the freight cost is going to be to ship those, because it's going to be different and sometimes drastically different if you're shipping product. I use a tool Freightos to get general calculations, and I can do calculations just off of a carton, a pallet, or 20-foot or a 40-foot container to kind of understand and what the freight cost might be. And it's pretty accurate based off like the rates that I could get. I found it's pretty similar. I've used this tool. I used it when I was helping a company find a freight solution from Senegal in Africa, and I don't have any contacts there, but I looked a bunch up freight forwarders and called and contacted a bunch, and I looked on Freightos and it recommended a forwarder that was there because we wanted to ship stuff via air. I contacted them, got a really good contact, and they were able to go pick it up in Senegal, and it was good way for us to make a connection and find someone in markets that otherwise we wouldn't be able to find a connection and get the pricing too, in advance. So we had an idea of what we were going to be spending on that freight. And then of course, verifying it. Don't rely just on the numbers that you're going to get from one inquiry, what those freight rates might be, and taking kind of market factors. So you understand, you don't make a very costly decision if you're going to say, hey, I'm going to get this out of this other country, but the freight rates are consistently higher. They don't have the infrastructure. Consider, when you're doing that, calculating those freight rates. This is just a screenshot from, I know you can't see it, but it's from Import Yeti, which is sweet. This is Walmart's supply chain. It's a bunch of lines all over the world. That's really the only thing I wanted to show there. It's like, hey, this is super complex. But it also shows who they're importing from. You know, what are these companies that they're actually purchasing from? Looks like, you know, their main overseas supplier that they're importing from is in India. They've had 25,000 containers since 2015 from that specific entity. They're probably consolidating shipments, acting as a trading company. It lists all their other companies that they're purchasing from. This can be used, you know, in a case study here where you may be looking for suppliers. I had a company, this was in 2020. 2021, that was they had kind of a bedding brand and they wanted to import mattresses. And I knew that mattresses recently there was anti-dumping countervailing duties on mattresses from China, where most of them were manufactured, that increased it to like, yeah, it was over 200, it was about 250%, I think, for mattresses from China that was imposed, I think in 2019 or it might have been 2020 when it went into effect. But we wanted to find, you know, hey, where are some alternative mattress manufacturers around the globe? Like, where are these other companies, you know, where do they move their supply chain? Because they're still selling mattresses for a relatively good price. Import Yeti kind of, you know, illuminated some of that. They're coming from Pakistan, Turkey. There's a few other countries on there as well. So it gave us some direction, at least for finding an alternative supplier. We said, hey, let's go. You know, there's probably some industry clusters and some manufacturing out there. You know, you want to run in, you do one other compliance, you know, complexity in importing is it's called transshipment, whereas, you know, China's just shipping those mattresses over to Pakistan and then they're putting made in Pakistan labeling on it and then we're purchasing it. That's another, you know, thing you definitely want to watch out for, because that's something US Customs looks at very closely. That's kind of what was happening with solar panels. Things were shipped to Southeast Asia and they say made in Vietnam, but hey, it's actually still made in China. So you still have to pay those 220, you know, % import duties, even though you didn't know, even though your supplier said that they were made in Vietnam or that they were made in Pakistan, but they're actually made in China. So if something looks too good to be true, and you're saying, hey, I'm purchasing this outside of China, it's not subject to those additional duties. It's still a really low cost, same the prices I could get in China. Like, look at that with some additional scrutiny, and you might want to do an audit or book an inspection to go check that, make sure that they're actually producing it there. Do they have the equipment? Is it actually made there? Maybe visit, especially if you're making an investment, because it could be super costly if you're purchasing something from outside of China that they say is made in Thailand, but it's actually just shipped across the border from China to Thailand. They're slapping made in China, made in Thailand on it. Then you could still be subject to those import duties or the duties that might apply specifically to China. So if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. But sometimes, you know, you might want to, or you always want to, if it looks too good to be true, definitely do a little bit more investigation, do some audits, do some inspections. So you want to go over some of the lessons here, just kind of best practices to wrap things up quickly. You know, lesson one, you know, empower yourself with those online tools, those ones I just shared. You know, they're available to the public. You know, if you're doing some strategic analysis of your supply chain, you know, go look at those. Who your competitors are importing from, check your rates. You know, look at your hiring someone maybe online on Upwork at the local market where you're exploring or where you currently are. There's a bunch of tools out there where you can access data or can, you know, do some of these own reviews on your own. They're just getting better and better and really empowering companies so they can do a lot of this stuff on their own. Lesson two, you know, incorporating that pre-compliance and cost reviews before you make the order, before you get a new product line, maybe, you know, reviewing before your next order, even if it's the same product, reviewing your classifications, your import duties, freight costs, getting that transparency if you don't have it, like a bill of materials, so that you can, you know, for compliance requirements and then also to fully understand your costs. You know, Tara had good recommendations on, you know, compliance as well. Yeah, Tara, you have any other recommendations for your product compliance and things,
Yeah.
best practices?
The one thing I always tell our clients is to just give compliance the importance that it deserves. At the end of the day, these products are going to consumers, they're going to children, and that could cause harm. It could cause safety issues, and that's just not going to be good for them, good for you. So do your pre-compliance. It's super important. Give it the importance it deserves. For multiple reasons.
So yeah, if you're like getting into a new product line, I worked with a lot of companies like this. So like, hey, There's one we're working with, I think in furniture, and they're like, hey, let's go into, electronics, because the furniture business isn't, and it's like, here, you're getting into a whole new compliance requirements there, you're gonna have additional costs, you're gonna have to get things UL listed. It's a different game. They're gonna have different regulatory bodies that oversee it, different costs. So just understand that, before you go into a new product, do it before that, before you start purchasing it or before you start selling it, as opposed to after. And then, lesson 3, review your current costs, your freight costs, customs fees. Look at those invoices. There's ways you can save money that are relatively quickly. Are you paying import duties directly? That can save you a couple % off the bat in every shipment that you have. What's your insurance policy like? If you're paying your cargo insurance on every shipment, like go get an annual policy, probably save you thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars a year just for the phone call. There's a bunch of small, quick changes that you can do. And I work with companies and they send me their invoices and it's like, dude, you're doing everything exactly perfect. No worries. You don't need to change anything. But in most cases, there's 1 or 2 things that need to be changed. And sometimes it's like, hey, you're paying the origin fees when you shouldn't be. And, just save you $100,000 every year making that change. Usually there's some cost savings that can be identified in those invoices. And I meant to let my colleague, Joshua, talk a little bit about the costs as well. One thing that you should also review are your, kind of beyond what the Empress does, but Joshua's Business Prosperity does is reviewing those kind of warehousing, inventory. Joshua, you want to talk a little bit about that as well? Just kind of beyond, after it gets to warehouse, thinking about your costs and all that as well.
So yeah, Owen and his team, they take care of everything, getting it overseas once it hits US soil, whether it's going to your own warehouse or going to a 3PL fulfillment center. That's kind of where I jump in and kind of helping out with inventory or forecasting, but I also have partnerships with 20 different 3PL and fulfillment centers throughout the US, whether it's for apparel, which, not every 3PL is different. Some do apparel, some don't. Some do large equipment that won't do small items. Some of them like to do 5 SKUs. Some of them like to do 2. So I have an idea of which 3PLs are a good fit for certain type of products and certain businesses. If you are looking around for a 3PL or a fulfillment center, it's really important to they don't present themselves in an apples to apples comparison. So you really have to sit down and look at all the costs associated with storage fees, receiving fees, implementation fees, and then obviously the fulfillment cost of getting it to your customer. So yeah, I take care of all of that, the 3PL inventory management, order fulfillment, order forecasting, things of that nature.
And the other important thing about this, checking your current costs is, checking what are your actual margins on your products. Are you looking at your landed cost? Are you looking at your total cost of ownership? How are you calculating your margins? And which products maybe there's room for improvement on the supply side, or maybe there's gaps in between. The product, there's the product price, but then there's all that, could be double your product price that you're paying in freight, duties and all of that. Maybe there's cost savings in there. And a lot of times there are. I mean, there's a lot of other cost savings opportunities that I didn't discuss today that we can help out with as well. For example, if you're importing and you're also exporting, you can get a refund, potentially can get a refund on the duties that you pay. So if you're paying a lot on import duties and then you're also exporting stuff, you could maybe get a refund on all of that. So things you can look at, or we can steer you in the right direction as service providers that focus on that. That's called duty drawback, for example. There's other ways you can, look at that, say, hey, where are those cost savings? Identifying, that's why I work with Joshua, which, I'm grateful we can work together because he can do that, that margin kind of calculation. Then we can raise red flags for ones where it's like, hey, there may be some room here to change this, and then do that landed cost also over time. How's that changing? How's your profit margin changing over time? And then the thing I don't do that Joshua does with his business prosperity is, retail pricing, the kind of competitive analysis, like, what's the positioning? So he might say, hey, this is a suggested retail price you could sell it for, here are the margins, and we'll work on, the supply side and the whole supply chain. So
kind of to expound on that, I have a certain client that we just realized that her total cost of ownership is much higher than she had expected. So we are doing a market research, doing a competitor analysis for any type of product that's competing against her products. But then also looking at how her financial statements, how her operations are broken down, where are all of her costs, to see where she can shore up some costs and her expenses. If we can't get that margin to a place that brings her to her certain profitability, we'll actually start to adjust her retail pricing to increase her gross profit to be more profitable at the end of the year. So there's a kind of a strategic approach to trying to figure out how to get, especially like a product centric business.
So, we have a few minutes, love to, if anyone has any questions, on that, yeah, there's a link here to that, sourcing and importer checklist. The list is actually much longer than that. If you put in all the processes that need to go in place, it's probably 4 pages instead of 1. But at least it's just kind of a guideline, for anyone that's, sourcing or importing, and some of the things that you need to think about. But, yeah, we'll open up if anyone has any questions.
I just have a comment. Holy crap, I had no idea that there was so much involved in me ordering a dang bottle of water or whatever.
Yeah.
This is, I'm really glad. Yeah, this is very informational. So thank you.
It's so complicated. You're like, it's just a t-shirt.
Well, and the compliance thing is very intriguing to me since I do compliancy stuff. And so I think that is super cool that you have that as such a major part of your business. So.
Well, thank you all. Yeah, I'll be around and we'll talk a little bit more about your supply chains, and that's what we love doing. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job.
Lots of
No idea.
Yeah.
We'll just send people to him.
Yeah. No, no.
Because this is way over his head.
I think I've learned all of that.